At the narrowest part of the Oslo fjord lies Oscarsborg. Constructed in the 17th century and equipped with ancient cannons, few give much thought to the old fortress. But in the spring of 1940, this tiny outpost proved pivotal when the Nazis set their sights on Norway. As the warship Blücher tried to stealthily lead an invasion flotilla past the fort, Colonel Birger Eriksen had but moments to identify whether the ship in the pre-dawn darkness was a friend or a foe, and bravely took the decision to unleash the old cannons Moses and Aaron at point-blank range. The result was devastating. Land-based torpedoes followed in a withering barrage. It was a moment that changed the course of the world. Colonel Birger Eriksen had been right. The Blücher had been the pride of the German Navy.
The Blücher blew up, exploded, and sank bang in the middle of the Oslo fjord. Nobody could get past. So the whole German fleet, invasion fleet, was held up.
Delayed but not deterred, the Nazis put troops ashore eventually and pressed on toward their goal. Norway's capital, Oslo.
My uncle was British minister in Oslo, successful woman, and he was very much involved in the whole thing.
Together with King Haakon, Crown Prince Olav, his family and parliament, they fled, being just nimble enough to escape the Nazi grasp.
The Blücher was sunk in the fjord and gave them time.
As they pushed northward, the king, ever hopeful, met with the Nazis in Elverum. But when he emphatically refused to endorse their puppet government, it was time to run again. They split into small groups. The king and crown prince stayed together, while Crown Princess Märtha took Princesses Ragnhild and Astrid to her homeland, unfriendly Sweden.
And the Swedes were not very hospitable or very keen on having them, and so they left more or less immediately for America.
Early on, the Allies landed troops, and the king sought them out. But with multiple losses and the need for soldiers on the battlefields of France, the call was made to withdraw. And the king was left to do the unthinkable. He had to leave with the Allies.
He was certainly very reluctant to leave. First time they wanted him to leave, he wouldn't. And then his government and my uncle persuaded him it was the best thing to do. It was the only thing to do, really. Otherwise, he'd be taken prisoner by the Germans and used as a hostage and all sorts of things.
King Haakon grudgingly agreed to depart from Tromsø, but only after one task was complete.
The king said the crown must not leave the country, so it should be hidden. And these two old gentlemen, King Haakon and my uncle, climbed up the cliffs in this cave and buried the crown in the cave. And there it remained for the whole war. They came back after the war and it was safe and sound.
After nearly 2 months of eluding the Nazis, the king was left to watch helplessly as Norway disappeared beyond the horizon.
The British government sent a battleship called the Devonshire to take the king and the government. My uncle was on the ship with them, on the Devonshire with them.
For King Haakon VII, born a Danish prince, and one of the only monarchs ever to be elected by referendum, his loyalty to the people of Norway ran deep. And his reluctance to leave his country was particularly strong.
They came to England and they stayed, first of all, at Buckingham Palace, and then the bombing of London was so intense that was the middle of the Blitz that the Norwegian government said they better find a safer haven. And I think probably with the help of my uncle, everything, they chose this house here, Bodal House. I was 9 years old, and I can remember very clearly all these great fleet of cars coming up the drive the day they all arrived. I was told to keep well out of the way, not to appear at all. So I was upstairs, but I was told next day that could come down. I was presented to the king in the library here before lunch. All the grown-ups were having drinks before lunch there. And I waited outside the door, having been presented to the king, and to watch them all go to lunch. And he came out, and he saw me hiding behind the door, rather. And he said, "Michael, what are you doing there?" So I said, "I just watched you all go to lunch, sir." And he said, "Well, come with me." And he picked me up in his arms and carried me into the dining room, dumped me down on the chair next to him, and talked to me all through lunch, after which I was never nervous of him again. You know, he was so nice always.
Both King Haakon and Crown Prince Olaf stayed for several years, and pieces of Norwegian heritage live on at Bowdown House, including one of Norway's most prestigious medals, the Royal Norwegian Order of St. Olaf. While most days at Bowdown were focused on the war, the Crown Prince still found time for a young Michael Dormer, who developed a long-standing friendship with Norway's future king.
King Olaf was absolutely sweet to me. He was very nice. I had a lot of toy soldiers, and he used to come and play sort of war games with me on the floor. And then after the war, of course, we went and stayed with him. He was... how can I describe him? He was immensely kind, charming, very, very, very nice indeed. And you could certainly tell he was a king.
Sadly for Crown Prince Olaf, the idyllic life of a king eluded him when Crown Princess Märtha was taken by cancer, just 3 years before he ascended to the throne. He was never the same.
I once, rather impertinently I suppose, said, "Is it fun being a king?" And he said, "Well, yes, sometimes it's fun, but you have no idea how lonely I am." They stayed here until 1943, when the house was taken over by the Air Ministry, principally for planning the landings in North Africa and then eventually the D-Day. And so we all moved. My mother found a house called Follington Park, just outside Windsor, and we all moved there, the whole lot of us.
Despite the inviting surroundings, King Haakon remained a driven man, as he ran the Norwegian government in exile and most famously delivered speeches regularly to Norwegians via BBC radio, stoking the passions of his citizens as they fought for a free Norway.
Well, I mean, he really inspired the whole country to go on resisting and keep going. What was his motto? All for Norway, wasn't it?
On May 8, 1945, after a turbulent occupation, Norway was once again free. King Haakon returned on June 7th, 5 years to the day after being forced into exile. The once Danish prince was welcomed back home by his people as a true Norwegian hero. In the decades following World War II, Norway hosted the Dormers of Bowdown House as they continued their long-lasting friendship with King Haakon and eventual King Olaf. Stays that included visits to the majestic Kongsgården in Oslo, not far from Oscarshall, named after Oscar II, the last king of unified Sweden and Norway. King Oscar was also one of Michael Dormer's distant ancestors. And as it turns out, he was related to our family as well. So Michael and I are distant cousins. Stately Bowdown House continued hosting prominent figures and events over the years. For me personally, it holds many, many fond memories, including delightful Sunday lunches and dinners. It also served as an introduction to Lord and Lady Carnarvon of Highclere Castle. and was often a surprise stop for Vikings' UK extensions, with Michael and Daphne capturing everyone's attention as they shared fascinating artifacts and tales of their earlier lives. Bowdown House, King Haakon, King Olaf, and Michael and Daphne Dormer are sure to be forever intertwined and remembered fondly for their role in ensuring a free Norway.